Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics at the Asia-Pacific Initiative in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Today I'm sitting down with Kristin Vekasi. She's the Mansfield Chair of Japanese and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the University of Montana. She also has an article recently published in the journal Pacific Affairs on Takaichi's election and Japan's grand strategy. Kristin, thanks a lot for sitting down with us today.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
Okay, so to set the scene, on January 8th, Japan announced measures to restrict exports of rare earths and dual-use technologies to Japan following Takaichi's comments about Japan's possible role in a contingency in the Taiwan Strait, which China was protesting. Since that announcement back in early January, there was just an article in the Nikkei this morning saying that Japan's rare earth imports from China have declined 80% since then. So help us understand what happened. Is this the result of a deliberate policy on the part of the Chinese? Is this a reflection of China's willingness to weaponize these sort of choke points? What's happened?
Yeah, it's been a really exciting, few months, half a year now, to be in the rare earths geopolitics space. It's June, right? So we're we actually have some data we could look at this point to really get into it. And so following these comments that Takaichi made in one of the diet debates relating to, of course, one of China's core interests and one of the areas where China is pretty much always going to have some sort of response. We did see these restrictions start to be put into place. And I think maybe we'll go into some of the details of how that works later, because I do think it's quite interesting. But this is a pattern that we've seen happen before between Japan and China specifically. And it's also a pattern that we've seen increasingly from China, the sort of willingness to use control of economic choke points in order to either respond, to try and push foreign policy goals, or in some cases, maybe just even to express foreign policy displeasure.
So what does China want out of all of this? Because, to provide some context on Takaichi's comments, she didn't really create a new policy for Japan. She mostly just said the quiet part out loud, which is its own issue. But that sort of leads to a presumption that if she were to back down in order to restore these exports, that would be a meaningful change of Japanese policy. Not the November statement, but walking back those comments would be the change. So is that something that China is actually trying to go for here, or is this just punishment to make an example of Takaichi, to demonstrate to others in the region and possibly even the United States that they're willing to use these kinds of measures as a coercive tool?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on here. And one is that certainly we have to think about international signaling and thinking about, if you're going to talk about Taiwan in a way we don't like, then, or we're, going to do something that goes against China's self-defined core interests, then there'll be a, really robust response. So, don't do that. Pay attention, respect China, that sort of thing. But there's also a lot of Chinese domestic politics, and I think a lot of those are more important, perhaps, even than the international signaling, as is often the case, right, in international relations. And anti-Japanese sentiment and anti-Japanese discussion, et cetera, has played a long-term role in domestic Japanese politics. And more than signaling to Japan, in part what the Chinese government, the party state is doing, is signaling to the Chinese people that they're tough, they're serious, and that their rhetoric on Taiwan is real and continues to be a core interest. And now that they've got that sort of nationalist train is going, it is very, very hard to stop it. And so in some ways, there's a really nice literature on this in international relations. To some extent, you can harness nationalist fervor and sentiment to further regime stability and legitimacy, but it also can bind the state as well, limiting the sorts of responses you have. So what does China want from Japan? I mean, they've said, like, repeat the core principles and the statements and whatnot. And I absolutely agree with your analysis. That is not something that Takaichi can really do within her domestic politics. And so
That sounds like really. Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, I'm
So that sounds like
here. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
no, I was
what do
going to
they
say
do?
that
Like,
sounds.
they're trapped.
Yeah, no, that sounds like really bad news for Takaichi. So is this just something that Japan is going to have to live with, or wait for China to get over its nationalist moment? We might be stuck here, it sounds like is what you're saying.
I think that there's a strong possibility that we're stuck here for a decent amount of time. And it's hard to know exactly what that will mean. There was an opportunity when Takaichi and Xi Jinping met recently, and that did not go in the way of conciliation. And if we think back to the last really protracted period of Japan-China relations from 2012 and the sort of semi-nationalization of the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, that lasted for about 2 years. And we didn't have the same sort of rare earth stuff happen at that time, but there were other economic consequences, and there were certainly freezes and top level political and cultural exchange. So I do think that this could be more protracted.
So let's go back to the 2010 rare earth embargo that China imposed as a result of that crisis that you mentioned. And in terms of its relevance for today, the number I keep, keeps getting stuck in my head, and you're the expert, so correct me if I've got the details wrong here. But in 2010, Japan depended on China for something like 90% of its rare earth exports, give or take. Imports, excuse me. Now, Japan depends on China for about 60% of its rare earth imports. So that's a 30% drop. Is that good? Is that a sign of Japan's progress in this space? Is this the best they could have done? Were there efforts that they left on the table? Like, how should we look at that drop? Because I do feel like if a lot of countries are going to be looking at what Japan has done in this space, they already are, and taking lessons. So what's been Japan's experience like? How have they done? How do you evaluate it?
Yeah, it's a interesting thing because it hasn't been linear, right? And that so we can say, okay, it was 90 or 90+%, and now it's 60-ish%. But there have been times in that interim where between 2010 and now in 2026, where it was still up back in like the 80-85% as well, depending sort of on demand or supply and demand, and China has remained, when it's available, the most efficient place to get these particular materials, and especially the downstream processed rare earths and whatnot. But I think one of the really important things, we have to halt for a minute and think, well, rare earth, there are 17 of them. They're not all the same things. So if we say, well, it's gone from 90 or 95% or whatever to around 60% of what kinds of rare earths, and so many of the sort of the lighter rare earths that are more on the top of the sediment when you're mining, Japan has done a stronger job of diversifying in those, and then the heavier rare earths, which are in some ways more difficult but also more rare, geologically rare, has still had a very high level of dependence on China. And so there really is this sort of bifurcation where I think Japan has done a very good job in diversifying in light rare earths and has struggled a bit more with the heavy rare earths. That said, Japan also does now have an alternative source of heavy rare earths as of very recently, in the last year, really. And so there has been, in terms of comparing Japan to other countries' attempts to diversify rare earths, I think Japan really is a standout. Is 60% enough to be independent from China? Well, it depends on how much money the companies are willing to spend. Because the non-Chinese rare earths cost a lot more, sometimes as much as 5 times more. And so that's when we think about economic security and you have to put national security or security considerations above profit considerations, like that is a huge concern. And saying, oh, you need to pay 5 times more for this essential material, that's a really, really tough price to pay for a profit-motivated company.
So let's unpack the alternatives a little bit, because one of the things that I've heard is that it's not the rare earths that China has such dominance in, it's the processing where
That's right.
China has dominance. Okay, so is this all just a question of everyone else stepping up their processing efforts? Because as I like to remind people, it's not an accident that all this processing ended up in China. It's a big part of it is because nobody wanted it in their backyards. It's nasty, ecologically horrible stuff. But now you do see people beginning to acknowledge, and people being experts, decision makers, beginning to acknowledge that maybe we do need to start doing more of our own processing. Well, that takes time and it's going to be more expensive. You hear the talk about, scraping the rare earths off the bottom of the ocean. But for now, I think China is the path of least resistance. So maybe just walk us through some of those alternative sources. What are the holdups? How much would it cost? And how much of this is really just going to make a meaningful impact? Get the 60% if you're Japan down to, 50, 40, pick your number.
Right, absolutely. So let's talk about the alternatives. And you might have to remind me of some of your other questions because I'm not taking as diligent of notes as I should here when you're asking when you're asking questions. But thinking about alternatives, so there's really three things sort of initially you can think about, and one is developing alternative sources. And so the conversation we've been having so far is really about looking for these diverse sources, geographically diverse sources. And we can think about some of the possibilities there, but then there's also developing recycling technologies. And a lot of that looks like sort of, urban recycling and getting the materials from electronics and vehicles and all of these things as they go offline. And then there's also looking for sort of reduction and substitution technologies. So either reducing the amount of whatever you're using or trying to develop some non-rare earth or non-cobalt or whatever, like this sort of risky material you have. And the Japanese government has been pursuing through grants, and also, of course, the private sector on their own, but has been pursuing these efforts, all of them since 2010. And so it's not just diversification. So there's a lot of other stuff on the table, but diversification is a really big part of the picture. And thinking about diversification, Japan has focused a lot of their efforts in the Indo-Pacific region. Some of the more successful ones have been in cooperation with Australian companies, particularly the company Lynas. And they've developed a supply chain through Malaysia. So the mining happens in Australia, and then the processing is happening in Malaysia, and a heavy rare earths oriented supply chain with that same sort of geographic distribution just started up quite recently. And it is, just as you said, right, we can look at that and say, okay, well, this is great. Like, this is a non-Chinese alternative, but the nasty processing facilities have gone to a, non-highly industrialized liberal democracy. And okay, so you are exporting this sort of polluting process elsewhere. And that is what has happened. And so that's a real, I think that's a sort of ethical burden and a moral burden that we really need to think through in terms of public policy. Japan has also been pursuing rare earth alternatives with Vietnam for quite some time, and that has stepped up in recent years, as well as, again, with India for a long time. That hasn't sort of paid off yet in terms of actual, large amounts of rare earths coming in, but there are these long-term partnerships. There are also lots and lots, many failed attempts where there was outreach, there was discussion, there were, some due diligence, et cetera, and then they did not turn into actual viable projects. And that's more normal than the successful projects. So we can point to the successes, but also like things with Japan and rare earths in Mongolia didn't work out. Kazakhstan didn't work out. Early efforts in the United States didn't work out. So there's a lot, and we could go on about this, but sometimes it's not economically viable. It's not profitable, or sometimes there's various political risks that are there. Sometimes infrastructure just isn't there. There's all sorts of reasons these projects don't go forward, and that's normal.
So it occurred to me we should probably step back a little bit and have you explain what are critical minerals and why are they important? Like if you lose access to them, what happens exactly? Because we talk about critical minerals all the time. You can put critical minerals into an article title and it'll get clicks, but I do feel like we don't always unpack what they are, what they mean, what they do. So yeah, now the floor is yours to help us understand that part of it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And so it's very interesting. So and in Montana these days, we're not talking about critical minerals, we're talking about critical materials, which is expanding beyond minerals. And we'll see if critical materials takes the world by storm or not. But thinking about critical minerals, one of the nicest descriptions I have heard of that I like for critical minerals is they're sort of the vitamins of industry, that they're often in very small amounts in all sorts of electronic gadgets and things that make our contemporary modern life possible. And you don't necessarily, you don't need a lot of them, but if they're not there, they just don't work. And so these things are in, our smartphones and our computers and our electric vehicles, our MRI machines, our satellites, there's all sorts of defense technologies as well that we see them in. And we call them critical, because they're important, of course, but it really is more of a political term. So if you, as a government, make a list of, important minerals, it's not something that maybe will get the kind of attention it's supposed to have. But when governments do make these critical mineral lists, usually there's something about scarcity or difficulty to get it, and sometimes there are some elements of economic importance. But it's a decision to say this is critical, this is not critical, and decide what sectors are important, what materials do we think are important, and then when they get those designations, sometimes there's more money.
Is what you're saying?
It's a what?
It's a normative construct.
It's totally a normative construct. Yes, and like other things, governments often tend to come to the same conclusions. And so there's the list, the world of critical mineral policies out there. Sort of the top, there's more than 100 different minerals that appear on a list. So this is a really, really broad concept, but there's a sort of a top 20 that appear on most lists, like 70% of the list. So there's a broad agreement about what these things are, but sometimes there's almost one-to-one agreement, like Indonesia and the US are like almost one-to-one. And so there's some convergence on agreement here.
So just to talk about the practical day-to-day stuff, if there is less access to critical minerals, does that mean we go without smartphones, without laptops, without satellites, without those defense applications? Do we just pay more for them? Is it a question of finding a more expensive substitute? I already know your answer. You're going to say it's complicated and it depends, but how much of this would the day-to-day user of these things really notice if there was a disruption, a significant disruption in these supplies?
Right. So in part because this is different a bit than, say, the Strait of Hormuz, because they are used in smaller amounts and companies are building in more political risk into their supply chain models than maybe they did 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And so there's a nice sort of cushion window where if the supply chains are disrupted, as an ordinary person, you would not notice. And it took 2 to 4 weeks with the Strait before it started to really come home.
And it's still ongoing, really.
And now the ripples coming out from that are going to take a very long time to readjust. But so it's and this is going to differ right from company to company and product to product, but probably there's somewhere between like 3 to 6 months at least where you won't really notice, and it won't be reflected in the price point or something like that because of stockpiling or whatnot. That said, most of these, for example, like rare earth magnets, there aren't great substitutes yet. I mean, of course, like people are way into the R&D, and deep into the R&D, like thinking about batteries, high-powered batteries, like really looking for non-cobalt batteries and stuff like that. But it's like right now, and in our near future window, if we have a year or 2 year disruption, it's really, really going to hit the prices of electronics. Probably companies will be able to find substitutes, just not good ones or cheap ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, this has been one of the critical minerals collaborations has been one of the few areas that I've found where the Trump administration is really willing to try to create some sort of multilateral, plurilateral frameworks for collaboration. How much stock do you put on those efforts? Is this a worthwhile endeavor? What are they trying to do? And do you see a chance of success, really?
Yeah. So the Trump administration, has a lot of new initiatives with critical minerals, and also a lot of initiatives that at least rhyme with what was happening before. And so we do, in the critical mineral space, I think have a lot more continuity between Biden, Trump than we do in maybe some of the other policy areas, although they have different names and sometimes different approaches. The Trump administration is working internationally to try and develop some of these international supply chains, including with Japan, and also has these, I guess, MOUs is really the best way to describe them. Framework agreements, perhaps, with countries in the Indo-Pacific and other places to work on critical mineral development. Those there's a real difference in the focus on sort of ESG principles with the Biden administration. But besides that, there are so many similarities in the language between, for example, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework under Biden, IPEF, and all that critical mineral stuff, and the Trump era things. Like, it's quite interesting. But so there's those efforts. But then a lot of what the Trump administration is doing has been domestic. And those things those are long-term projects that are coming to fruition now. Some of them started 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And now there is this big new injection of capital, as well as a partial government ownership in some of the rare earth projects and other mineral mining and processing projects. I think it's good for countries to internalize the costs of these projects rather than export them abroad. I think that's a better way to do it.
When you say internalize the costs, what are you talking about specifically?
If we need more of a natural resource and we have it at home, we should figure out how to do it right at home rather than exporting it somewhere we can't see it. Exporting the pollution and the negative externalities of mining somewhere we just can't see it, and happily having our clean, fancy products without having to see the mess. I think we should try and do the mess right at home instead.
And if the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard folks, say, no, not in my backyard, well, then what?
That's why it's important to do it at home and have the right process.
Because
it's not like the folks in Malaysia at the Linus plant also are saying that.
Oh,
you're right.
Yeah, of course.
There have been massive protests. They may have to relocate the plant. It's had so much trouble, and just because it's not happening where we can't see it. But there are all sorts of processes that we can use, and sometimes those will be effective, and sometimes they won't be. But the people in those communities absolutely have a right to be heard and to talk about it and to figure out whether it's going to work or not, and the way it might work. And it's a tough world. And it's a very complicated issue. But if I want to drive an electric car, I better be prepared to pay the cost that it takes to make an electric car as well.
I'll have you unpack that a little bit more. How much does all of this business, the critical mineral business, the export, the processing business, how much does all of this depend on this just being shunted off into, relatively marginalized countries, relatively marginalized communities? Because I'm going to guess even in China's case, a lot of these processing facilities are nowhere near Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing. They're probably off someplace where
Inner Mongolia.
There you go. Okay, so how much does this all depend on the weight of these communities?
So much. It depends so much. And I mean, to give you what this is maybe the example that horrifies me personally the most right now is that rare earth demand has gone up tremendously in China as well. And they're also, and prices have gone up because of supply and demand. And there are new environmental regulations in China, which is wonderful. And it's harder to do things with endless abundance and low costs because there are regulations that are being actually enforced. And so much of the rare earth mining has moved across the border to Myanmar, which is also and so right across the border from Myanmar and China is another place that's very abundant in rare earths, as well as in Inner Mongolia. And so in Myanmar, they're having a civil war. This is a conflict zone. This is a Kachin state, which is one of the large ethnic minorities that is in conflict with the ruling military junta. And they have this horrifically dirty and polluting rare earth mining that much of it is not, it's done by hand. And then there are some processing facilities that happen there. A lot of it's shipped over to China. And then a lot of those rare earths, we see them show up. Some of them, you can see that their origin is Myanmar, but a lot of them show up as Chinese rare earths. And it's even in the cases where it's oh, wow, China's really upped its game and it's getting better there. And it's but they've also started to export the nasty parts to a group of people that are in the hardest of hard situations. And those situations and those conditions have further convinced me that trying to have the negative externalities be in a place where we can regulate them and see them and take them very seriously is important as a goal.
So final question.
So that's sort of my normative stance on it. How does that relate to Japan? Well, deep sea mining.
That was going to be my final question. But no, because look, like I alluded to before, they are going to talk. They have been talking about they're planning to scrape this stuff off the bottom of the ocean floor. Which, nobody lives on the bottom of the ocean floor, but you do this long enough and intensively enough, and you will see other negative externalities. So,
for sure.
Yeah, I'll just let you have the final word. I'll let you take it where you want to go.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one thing that's so interesting about this. The deep sea mining stuff is that the first sort of successful testing scrape happened in early February of this year, or late January, right around there. And it looked it was wow, China put rare earth restrictions on these Japanese companies and they're really struggling, but look, they have deep sea mining. It's they just pulled it out. It's oh no, they started that 15 years ago. It was such a coincidence, right? That it happened, the sort of first result happened right after the restrictions. They had it scheduled for any time and they were do it now. I don't know. That would have been a brilliant political move on the Takaichi government's part, or Medi, or whoever is, whatever strategist is out there working on making sure that it continues to get funded. But so it's a very difficult process in terms of whether it is actually economically viable. I'm still not convinced. I could be convinced, but it's a tough one because I agree we don't know what the long-term consequences, environmental consequences might look like. But in terms of human stakeholders, it seems like it. I've heard people who are very committed to sort of these principles I've outlined think that deep sea mining is a really reasonable public policy approach, because it might take care of, if we need more resources for green technology for the long term. And right now, in the long term, we can recycle, but right now we need to mine. And maybe that's the way to do it. But it's such new technology, and I do worry that the other places that we're seeing, some of the other places we're seeing deep sea mining being discussed and initial, surveys being done and whatnot, are in small Pacific island nations, and they really don't want it done there, and it's the same story all over again.
Okay, well, on that note, I do have to say your research is a very good illustration of the political scientist's curse. May your research be relevant, because wow, is it relevant. But this has been really great. Thanks a lot for joining us. This has been Kristin Vekasi with the University of Montana, and has a new article out in Pacific Affairs. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. An earlier version of this podcast described how the blue stone in King Tutankhamun's funerary mask is lapis lazuli that seems to have come from Afghanistan. The question of how it made its way from Afghanistan to Egypt is still the subject of debate. It may never be known for certain. But a route that would have connected those different parts of the world would have included the Royal Road that stretched from Susa in what's now southern Iran to Sardis in western Anatolia in today's Turkey. The road was constructed during the Achaemenid Empire of the 5th century BCE, which itself stretched from the Indus River in the east all the way to Thrace and Libya in the west. It was one of the world's first large empires, and as such, needed to maintain networks of communication across its vast distances. The Royal Road was created for this purpose, building upon earlier roads and paths and joining them together into a major thoroughfare that stretched 1,700 miles across the empire. The result of its construction was that distances that would have taken a regular traveler 3 months to cross could instead be crossed by its couriers in 7 to 9 days, enabled by 111 posting stations, each supplied with fresh horses. Guards posted throughout the road provided security to courtiers and merchants, enabling freer trade between the different parts of the empire and expanding commerce, and allowing trade of goods like spices, grains, and precious stones like lapis lazuli. The Greek historian Herodotus praised the courtiers on this road, saying that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. A phrase that will sound familiar to Americans as the unofficial motto of the U.S. Postal Service. Whether or not the lapis lazuli in King Tutankhamun's mask traveled the Royal Road or not, it was an impressive achievement in its own right, and its legacy is still with us to this day. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show. So send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at API for making this happen, and we'll talk to you next time.